Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling family sagas ever to unfold in the heart of Appalachia. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can, not through supernatural horror, but through the very human capacity for greed to corrupt the bonds of blood itself. We're about to delve into a mystery that consumed an entire bloodline across 3 decades, where an inheritance worth millions today became a death sentence for 9 family members, and where the very mountains that promised wealth became tombs for those who dared claim it. This is a tale where trust was weaponized, where kinship was no shield against murder, and where prosperity brought only devastation. It was the year 1934. The Great Depression had crushed America beneath its merciless weight for 5 brutal years. Bread lines snaked through cities. Banks had shuttered their doors, swallowing the life savings of millions. Dust storms were beginning to darken the skies of the Great Plains, turning farmland into wasteland. But in the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky, in the shadow of Black Mountain, life had always been hard. The Depression, for many, was simply a new name for an old struggle. The Cumberland Mountains rise like the spine of some ancient, sleeping beast across the border regions of Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee. These are not the gentle, rolling hills of pastoral imagination. They are severe formations, jagged ridges clawing at low, hanging clouds, valleys so deep and narrow that sunlight reaches the bottom for only a few hours each day, forests so dense that a person could disappear 20 feet from a trail and never be found. In these mountains, isolation was not a choice, but a geographical inevitability. Communities clung to creek beds and ridge tops, connected by paths that challenged even the surest-footed mule. The outside world felt distant, almost theoretical. News arrived late and filtered through layers of retelling. Federal laws seemed suggestions at best. Family was everything because often family was all there was. Harlan County, Kentucky, had earned its reputation through coal and blood. The coal seams ran deep and rich through the mountains, black gold that had drawn mining companies and the men desperate enough to work for them. Company towns sprang up like mushrooms after rain rows of identical houses. Company stores where scrip replaced currency, tipples and slag heaps that transformed the landscape into something industrial and brutal. But not everyone worked in the mines. Some families had been in these mountains since before Kentucky was even a state, back when Daniel Boone was still carving paths through the Cumberland Gap. They were farmers, loggers, moonshiners, and independent folk who viewed the coal companies with suspicion and the federal government with outright hostility. They lived by older codes of honor and vengeance, of blood debt and family obligation. The Mortimer family, though we'll call them by this pseudonym to protect surviving relatives, as this story draws from multiple documented cases across the region, had occupied a particular hollow in Harlan County since 1798. 7 generations had been born, lived, and died within a 10-mile radius of the original homestead. They had survived Indian raids, the Civil War, floods, feuds, and the encroachment of modernity with varying degrees of success. The family patriarch in 1934 was Silas Mortimer, 73 years old, and as much a feature of the landscape as the limestone outcroppings that studded the hillsides. Silas was lean and hard, his face carved by weather and work into something resembling the mountains themselves, all sharp angles and deep hollows. His hands were gnarled as old roots, but still capable of splitting firewood or steadying a rifle. Silas had done what few in the region had managed. He had accumulated substantial property, not through coal or timber rights, though he had some of both. His true wealth lay in land, over 3,000 acres of mountain real estate that included farmland, forest, water rights, and, crucially, mineral rights that he'd never sold to the mining companies. This was no small feat in an area where companies regularly pressured, tricked, or occasionally forced families into selling their mineral rights for pennies on the dollar. By the standards of the Hollow, Silas Mortimer was rich. By the standards of the nation, even in the depths of the Depression, his property had significant value estimated at $30,000 to $40,000, the equivalent of well over $500,000 in today's currency. More importantly, whispers suggested that beneath his land lay an untapped coal seemed potentially worth 10 times that amount. The mining companies had come calling many times. Silas had sent them away with increasing degrees of hostility. But Silas Mortimer had a problem. He had heirs, 13 of them, to be precise. The Mortimer clan had expanded across the generations like a sprawling oak, branches extending in every direction, some strong, others twisted and weak. Silas had fathered 7 children with his wife Martha, who died giving birth to the last one in 1902. Of those 7, 5 had survived to adulthood and produced children of their own. Factor in Silas's 2 surviving siblings and their offspring, and the family tree became a tangled thicket of competing claims and complicated relationships. The eldest was Thomas Mortimer, 50, 1 year old in 1934. Thomas had inherited his father's build, but not his temperament. Where Silas was stern but fair, Thomas was sullen and prone to explosive anger. He'd been married 3 times. The first wife had left him. The second had died under circumstances that generated quiet speculation. And the third, a woman named Rebecca, 20 years his junior, seemed perpetually frightened of him. Thomas worked sporadically in the mines and drank consistently. He had 2 sons from his first marriage, both in their 20s, both already developing their father's mean streak. The second child was Eliza Mortimer Blackburn, 48, married to a moderately successful timberman named Vernon Blackburn. Eliza was sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, the kind of woman who kept meticulous records and missed no slight, intentional or otherwise. She had cultivated a veneer of respectability, hosting church socials and organizing community events. But those who knew her well understood that beneath the Christian charity was calculating ambition. She had 3 children, all daughters, who she'd raised with the understanding that marrying well was the only escape from mountain poverty. Third came Samuel Mortimer, 46, and perhaps the closest to his father in temperament. Samuel was quiet, hardworking, and honest to a fault. He'd married late to a schoolteacher named Anne, and together they ran a small but productive farm in an adjacent hollow. They had 4 children, all still young, all being raised with education and prospects. Samuel neither smoked nor drank, attended church every Sunday, and by all accounts was the most beloved member of the family. This, as it would turn out, did not save him. The 4th child, Rachel, had died young from influenza in 1918, leaving behind a widower and 2 orphaned children who'd been raised by various family members. The children, now adults in their 20s, remained part of the complicated inheritance equation. The youngest surviving child was James Mortimer, 39, who'd left the mountains for 5 years to work in Detroit's automobile factories before the crash of 29 sent him back home. Broke and bitter, James had seen the outside world, had tasted its possibilities, and the return to the Hollow felt like a prison sentence. He was unmarried, living in a 2-room cabin on his father's land, and spending most of his time hunting, fishing, and nurturing resentments. Silas's 2 surviving siblings added their own complications. His brother Ephraim, 71, had 3 grown children, and claimed that a verbal agreement made decades ago entitled him to a portion of the estate. His sister Margaret, 68, a widow, had 5 children and grandchildren, and believed that as the only surviving daughter of the original Mortimer patriarch, she had special claim to the family homestead itself. In this volatile mixture of blood relations, old grievances, and desperate circumstances, Silas Mortimer made a decision in the spring of 1930, that would seal the fate of 9 people. He decided to write a will. The problem with wills in isolated mountain communities was trust specifically, the lack of trustworthy legal infrastructure. The county seat was 2 days' travel by mule in good weather. Lawyers were expensive and often viewed as agents of the very government and corporate interests that mountain people distrusted. Legal documents could be challenged, falsified, or conveniently lost. Silas's solution was older than American law itself. He called a family meeting. It was April, late in the month, when the dogwoods were blooming like white ghosts through the greening forest. Silas sent word through his children that all family members were to gather at the homestead on the last Sunday of the month. This was not unusual. The Mortimers gathered several times a year for weddings, funerals, and holidays, but the formal nature of the summons created tension. Everyone knew what it meant. The old man was making his intentions known. The homestead sat on a relatively flat bench of land carved from the mountainside by generations of Mortimers. The main house was a log structure that had been expanded over decades into a rambling, asymmetrical building with a wide front porch and a tin roof that drummed like thunder when it rained. Behind it stood a barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar dug into the hillside, and several smaller outbuildings in various states of repair. A spring-fed creek ran alongside the property, its water clear and cold even in summer. They came from all directions that Sunday, on foot, on horseback, in the few battered automobiles and trucks that could navigate the rough roads. By early afternoon, over 30 people had assembled, representing every branch of the family tree. Children played in the yard while adults gathered in tight clusters, speaking in low voices, eyes constantly moving to watch who else had arrived, who was speaking to whom. Silas waited until everyone had gathered before emerging from the house. He stood on the porch, a Bible in one hand and a hand-written document in the other, and surveyed his assembled family with those piercing eyes that missed nothing. "I'm old," he began, his voice still strong despite his years. "I've lived through more than most, and I've held this land through times when others lost everything. I built something that can sustain this family for generations if it's handled right." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "But I've also watched this family tear itself apart over petty jealousies and old grudges. I've seen brothers stop speaking over borrowed tools, sisters feuding over imagined slights. I won't have my death be the spark that burns this family down." Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A baby cried and was quickly shushed. "So I'm dividing the property now, while I'm still alive, in a way I think is fair. Some will get more, some will get less, and I don't want to hear any arguments about it, because this is final." What Silas proposed was complicated, perhaps intentionally so. The land would be divided into 13 portions, but not equal portions. Thomas, as the eldest son, would receive the homestead and 200 acres surrounding it. Samuel would receive 300 acres of prime farmland. Eliza would receive mineral rights to a 200-acre parcel that had shown promising coal indicators. The grandchildren would receive smaller parcels, some as small as 50 acres, but all with some combination of resources, timber, water, or potential mineral value. The catches, and there were several, created the seeds of disaster. First, no one could sell their portion for 10 years without the consent of all other heirs. This was designed to prevent the family from being picked apart by outside interests. Second, if any heir died without direct descendants before the 10-year period ended, their portion would be redistributed equally among the surviving heirs. Third, the mineral rights were separated from surface rights in several cases, meaning one family member might own the land while another owned whatever lay beneath it, a Byzantine arrangement that would require cooperation for anyone to profit. Fourth, and most controversially, Silas retained the right to modify the will until his death if he witnessed behavior that he deemed contrary to family interest. This last provision was a loaded gun aimed at every family member's head. Silas essentially maintained the power to disinherit anyone at any time based on his own judgment. It was meant to keep the peace. It had the opposite effect. The gathering broke up in a swirl of barely suppressed emotions. Some family members approached Silas individually, trying to argue or negotiate. He refused to discuss it further. By sunset, the hollow was empty again except for Silas and the few family members who lived on the property with him. 3 weeks later, Thomas Mortimer was found dead at the bottom of a ravine. The official story was an accident. Thomas had been drinking. This was confirmed by the half-empty jar of moonshine found near the body, and had apparently lost his footing on a steep trail after dark. The fall was substantial, easily 50 feet, and the rocks at the bottom were unforgiving. His neck was broken, his skull fractured. Death would have been instantaneous. The funeral was held on a gray May morning when fog clung to the hollows like grief itself. The entire family attended, dressed in their worn Sunday best, faces carefully neutral. The local preacher spoke of God's mysterious ways and the dangers of strong drink. Thomas was buried in the family cemetery that crowned a nearby hill, where generations of Mortimers had been laid to rest beneath rough, cut stones. What wasn't said at the funeral was louder than any eulogy. Thomas had been the heir to the homestead, the most valuable single piece of the inheritance. With his death, that property, according to Silas's Byzantine arrangement, would be redistributed among the surviving heirs. Thomas's 2 sons, as his direct descendants, would receive something, but not everything. The rest would flow to others. Moreover, Thomas had been heard arguing loudly with Samuel 2 days before his death. Witnesses, family members whose testimony would prove suspiciously flexible, reported that Thomas had accused Samuel of conspiring with their father to diminish his inheritance. Thomas had been drunk and belligerent, making threats. Samuel had remained calm, which somehow made him seem more guilty to those already predisposed to suspicion. The sheriff, a lean, weathered man named Hargrove, who'd been navigating mountain justice for 20 years, came to investigate. He spent 3 days interviewing family members, examining the death scene, and trying to determine whether Thomas's death was genuinely an accident or something darker. The problem with investigating a death in a place like Harlan County, especially within a family as insular as the Mortimers, was that truth became fluid. Every family member had their own version of events, their own interpretation of what happened and why. Some genuinely believed Thomas had simply fallen drunk to his death. Others were certain it was murder, but disagreed about who was responsible. A few hinted darkly that Silas himself might have arranged it, though how a 73-year-old man could overpower and kill his 51-year-old son was never adequately explained. Sheriff Hargrove ultimately ruled the death accidental. There simply wasn't enough evidence to support any other conclusion. Thomas had been drinking. The trail was dangerous. Tragic accidents happened in the mountains all the time. The case was closed. But in the hollows and along the creek beds, in the quiet conversations between neighbors and the whispered exchanges after church services, doubt festered like an infected wound. 2 months passed. Summer heat settled over the mountains, heavy and oppressive, turning the hollows into green, walled ovens. Crops grew, corn reached toward the sky, life continued its rhythms, and then Ephraim Mortimer, Silas's 71-year-old brother, died in his sleep. This death seemed innocent enough. Ephraim was old, had a weak heart, and had been complaining of chest pains for weeks. His daughter found him on a Tuesday morning, cold in his bed, a peaceful expression on his weathered face. The local doctor, such as he was, with minimal formal training but decades of mountain medicine experience, examined the body and declared it a natural death. Heart failure, common in men of his age, no reason to suspect anything untoward. The funeral was smaller than Thomas's. Ephraim was buried beside his wife, who died a decade earlier. Silas stood at the graveside, his face unreadable, his body rigid as the stones surrounding them. What people noticed, what generated new whispers, was the timing. With Ephraim's death, his portion of the potential inheritance, he'd been one of the original heirs in Silas's complicated will, would now be redistributed. His 3 children would receive something, but the bulk would flow to others. It was Eliza who first voiced what others were thinking. 3 days after Ephraim's funeral, she arrived at the homestead unannounced, pushed past Silas's protests, and sat him down at his own kitchen table. 2 deaths in 2 months, she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Both men who stood to inherit substantial portions. Are you really going to sit there and tell me that's coincidence? Silas's response was cold. I'm going to tell you to go home and tend to your own affairs. Death comes for all of us, Eliza. I didn't write that law. Maybe not, she replied. But you wrote a will that makes every one of us more valuable dead than alive. You created a situation where each death enriches the survivors. Did you not think about what that might inspire in desperate people? Silas stood, ending the conversation. Get out of my house. Eliza left, but not quietly. Within a week, everyone in the family had heard some version of her theory. The will itself was cursed, or more accurately, was creating its own curse by turning family members into potential threats to one another. In a time of crushing poverty, when the difference between survival and starvation could hinge on a few acres of land or a small percentage of mineral rights, people were capable of terrible things. Sheriff Hargrove heard the rumors too. He made discreet inquiries, spoke to Silas, reviewed both death reports, and ultimately concluded there was nothing to investigate. A drunk man fell. An old man's heart gave out. Tragic but not criminal. The mountains took lives regularly through mishap and natural causes. Without evidence of foul play, what was he supposed to do? The answer came in September, when Samuel Mortimer failed to return home from a trip to the county seat. Samuel had left early on a Monday morning, riding his mare down the mountain path toward the main road where he could catch a ride into town. He'd planned to file some paperwork at the courthouse, purchase supplies, and return before nightfall. His wife Anne wasn't worried when he didn't arrive home that evening. Trips to town often took longer than planned, especially if you encountered neighbors or business took longer than expected. By Tuesday evening, when Samuel still hadn't returned and the mare had wandered home alone, Anne was frantic. She sent word to family members and neighbors, and by Wednesday morning, a search party of 20 men was combing the trails between the homestead and the main road. They found Samuel's body Wednesday afternoon in a creek bed about 2 miles from home. He'd been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head. His saddlebags were gone, along with whatever money he might have been carrying. The mare's saddle had been removed, presumably because it had value. This looked like robbery, plain and simple, except robbery wasn't simple in these mountains. Everyone knew everyone else. Strangers stood out, and Samuel Mortimer had been well liked, the kind of man who made friends easily and enemies rarely. Who would kill him for a few dollars and a saddle? Sheriff Hargrove treated this as a murder from the beginning. He brought deputies, interviewed dozens of people, examined the scene with meticulous care. The shots had come from concealment, probably someone waiting in the trees above the trail. It was an ambush, calculated and cold. This wasn't a crime of passion or a drunken confrontation gone wrong. This was execution. The investigation consumed weeks. Hargrove looked at strangers passing through the area at dawn, on their luck, men who might commit murder for a few dollars, at feuds Samuel might have had that no one wanted to admit. He came up empty. No physical evidence pointed to a specific person. No witnesses had seen anything useful. The murder weapon was never found. What Hargrove couldn't ignore, though, was the pattern. 3 heirs dead in 5 months. 3 substantial portions of an inheritance now flowing to the survivors. And he couldn't ignore what one of his deputies pointed out during a late-night conversation over coffee and frustration. Samuel had been the most beloved member of the family, the one person everyone spoke of with genuine affection and respect. If someone wanted to thin the herd of heirs without generating excessive suspicion, Samuel was exactly the wrong person to target, unless you were trying to make it look like an outside job. The funeral for Samuel Mortimer was the largest gathering Harlan County had seen in years. Over 200 people attended, including families from neighboring counties who'd heard of his kindness over the years. Anne and the children were devastated, genuinely shattered by grief. Silas stood like a stone monument, his face revealing nothing, but those close to him noticed his hands trembling as he threw dirt on his son's coffin. After the funeral, the family began to fracture in earnest. Accusations flew in private, with various members suspecting various others. Eliza insisted it was James, the bitter, unemployed youngest son, who'd inherit significantly from each death. James countered that it was obviously Thomas's sons, seeking revenge for their father's death. Thomas's sons suggested that Eliza's timber, barren husband Vernon, had the resources and ruthlessness to orchestrate murders for profit. Margaret's children implied that Silas himself might be orchestrating the deaths to force the surviving family into some kind of cohesion through fear. The only thing everyone agreed on was that the deaths weren't coincidence. The inheritance had become a killing field. Sheriff Hargrove made a decision that was part law enforcement and part mountain wisdom. He called the entire Mortimer family together for a meeting at the courthouse. This was unprecedented. Sheriffs didn't typically convene families like juries, but Hargrove had concluded that traditional investigation wasn't working. If the killer was a family member, as seemed increasingly likely, then maybe public pressure and the weight of communal judgment could force a confession or at least change the dynamic. The meeting took place on a cold October afternoon. The courthouse was a modest building by city standards, 2 stories of red brick with high windows and a courtroom that could hold perhaps 100 people if they squeezed in tight. The entire Mortimer family attended, minus the 3 who were dead. They filled the front rows, a sea of suspicious faces and nervous energy. Hargrove stood before them and spoke plainly. "Members, are we might deed. A biological level alike of at least 2 were murdered, Samuel for certain, and probably Thomas as well. Ephraim I'm less sure about, but the timing makes me suspicious. Someone in this room knows what happened. Someone in this room might be responsible. And if these deaths continue, I'm going to start arresting people even with weak evidence, because what's happening in your family cannot be allowed to continue." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Silas stood. "Sheriff, with respect, you're wasting your time and ours. If there's a killer among us, they're not going to confess because you asked politely. And if you start arresting innocent people, you'll tear this family apart worse than these deaths already have." "Then what do you suggest?" Hargrove asked. "I suggest you do your job and find evidence. And I suggest my family members stop acting like scared children and start acting like adults who trust each other." It was a nice sentiment. It was also completely divorced from reality. The meeting ended with nothing resolved and tensions higher than before. As the family dispersed into the darkening afternoon, Hargrove watched them go and felt a deep unease. He was watching a slow-motion disaster, and traditional law enforcement seemed powerless to stop it. Winter arrived early that year. By November, snow was falling regularly, coating the mountains in white, muffling sound, making travel treacherous. The Mortimer family retreated into their respective properties, contact between them dwindling to necessary minimums. It was as if they'd collectively decided that distance was the only safety, that avoiding each other might prevent further deaths. It didn't work. In January of 1935, Eliza's husband Vernon Blackburn was killed when his truck's brakes failed on a steep mountain road. The vehicle plunged through a guardrail and tumbled 300 feet down the mountainside. Vernon died on impact. The truck was destroyed, and when investigators examined what was left of the brake system, they found evidence of tampering. The brake line had been partially cut, designed to fail under stress. This was the fourth death. This was unambiguous murder, and this time Sheriff Hargrove had both evidence and motivation to act. The investigation into Vernon Blackburn's death was different from the beginning. For one thing, Vernon wasn't a Mortimer by blood. He'd married into the family. His death didn't directly redistribute inheritance according to Silas's will. But Eliza, now a widow, would control both her own portion and whatever Vernon had accumulated through his timber business. She'd become one of the wealthiest members of the family overnight. For another thing, the evidence was tangible. Someone had accessed Vernon's truck, which he kept in a barn behind his house, and deliberately sabotaged it. This required knowledge, opportunity, and planning. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence. This was calculated. Hargrove began with the obvious question: who had access to Vernon's barn? The answer was troubling. The barn wasn't locked. Vernon had never worried about theft in a community where everyone knew everyone. Any family member, any neighbor, any person familiar with the property could have entered that barn without difficulty. The sheriff's next question was more productive: who had the knowledge to sabotage brakes in a way that would cause delayed failure? This narrowed the suspect pool considerably. Most mountain people in 1935 had minimal experience with automobiles. But James Mortimer had worked for 5 years in Detroit's automobile factories. He would have intimate knowledge of vehicle mechanics. Hargrove brought James in for questioning. The interview lasted 6 hours and covered everything from James's whereabouts during the week before Vernon's death to his feelings about the inheritance situation. James was defensive but not evasive. He admitted he knew how to sabotage brakes. He admitted he'd visited Vernon's property within the relevant time frame, though he claimed it was to discuss timber prices, as he'd been helping Samuel's widow and manage the timber on Samuel's former land. He admitted he stood to inherit more with each death, but insisted he'd never act on that motive. Sheriff, James said during one heated exchange, if I was killing family for money, why would I start with Vernon? He's not even a blood heir. His death doesn't benefit me directly at all. You're looking at me because I worked in Detroit, because I know about cars, but you're ignoring the obvious. Whoever's doing this is smarter than you're giving them credit for. They killed Vernon to throw suspicion on me specifically because I have the mechanical knowledge. It was a good argument. It was almost convincing. Hargrove had to release him due to lack of physical evidence, placing him at the scene during the sabotage. But the sheriff wasn't done. He expanded his investigation to include a detailed audit of the entire family's movements, finances, and relationships. He reviewed land records, studied Silas's will in detail, and interviewed everyone from neighbors to the county clerk. What emerged was a portrait of a family in crisis, where decades of accumulated grievances had been weaponized by an inheritance structure that made each member simultaneously victim and potential perpetrator. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a child. One of Rachel's orphan children, now a young woman named Mary, 26 years old, came to the sheriff's office on a cold February morning. She was terrified, shaking, and insisted on speaking to Hargrove alone. Once the door closed, she told him a story that reframed everything. Mary explained that she'd overheard a conversation between Eliza and her eldest daughter, Caroline, 2 weeks before Vernon's death. They'd been speaking in low voices in the kitchen, thinking the house was empty, but Mary had been in an adjacent room and heard every word. Eliza had said, "Vernon's becoming a problem. He's talking about selling the timber rights, taking the money, and moving to Lexington. If he does that, we lose our chance at the mineral rights. We lose everything Father promised us." Caroline had replied, "What can we do about it? We can't force him to stay." And Eliza, according to Mary's testimony, had responded, "We can't force him, but we can make it impossible for him to leave." Mary admitted she hadn't understood the significance of the conversation at the time. She'd thought Eliza was planning to talk Vernon out of moving, maybe threaten legal action. It was only after Vernon's death, after the evidence of sabotage emerged, that Mary realized the conversation might have been planning something far darker. Hargrove listened to this with careful attention, taking detailed notes. He asked Mary why she'd waited so long to come forward. She admitted she'd been terrified of Eliza, of what might happen to her if she accused her cousin's mother of murder. But the deaths were accelerating, and Mary feared she might be next. She was an heir too, after all, and her death would benefit the survivors. Armed with this testimony, Hargrove obtained a warrant to search Eliza's property. What he found in the barn was damning: a hacksaw with metal filings that matched the composition of Vernon's brake line, and a book about automobile mechanics with a page about brake systems, dog-geared and annotated. On February 19, 1935, Sheriff Hargrove arrested Eliza Mortimer Blackburn for the murder of her husband Vernon Blackburn. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Eliza was a pillar of the church, a community organizer, a woman who'd cultivated an image of respectability and moral authority. The idea that she might be a calculating killer seemed impossible until people started remembering small things. The way she'd always tallied who owed what to whom. The way she'd obsessively tracked the inheritance provisions. The cold calculation beneath her Christian charity. Eliza maintained her innocence. Her daughters swore their mother would never commit murder. Her attorney, brought in from Lexington at considerable expense, argued that the evidence was circumstantial at best. Lots of people had hacksaws. The book about mechanics proved nothing. Mary's testimony was unreliable, the product of a traumatized orphan projecting her fears onto an overheard conversation. But Hargrove wasn't finished. With Eliza in custody, he doubled down on investigating the other deaths. If Eliza killed Vernon, might she have killed the others? Did she have opportunity? Did she have help? The investigation revealed that Eliza had been present at Thomas's funeral along with everyone else, and had opportunities to interact with Thomas in the days before his death. Multiple witnesses now came forward to report that they'd seen Eliza and Thomas arguing about inheritance 2 days before he died. The argument had been heated, with Thomas accusing Eliza of manipulating their father against him. Regarding Samuel's death, the timeline was more complicated. Eliza had no obvious connection to the ambush killing, but Hargrove discovered financial records showing that Eliza had paid a man named Colton Reese, a drifter with a violent history, $50. 3 weeks before Samuel was killed, Eliza claimed it was payment for logging work. Hargrove couldn't prove otherwise, but Colton Reese had left the region the day after Samuel's murder and hadn't been seen since. Ephraim's death remained the murkiest. Heart failure was a legitimate cause of death for a 71-year-old man. But Hargrove learned that Eliza had visited Ephraim the day before he died, bringing him a meal she'd prepared herself. She'd done this several times in the weeks before his death, playing the role of concerned niece. Had she poisoned him gradually, without exhuming the body and conducting sophisticated tests that weren't readily available in rural Kentucky in 1935, there was no way to know for certain. The trial of Eliza Mortimer Blackburn began on April 8, 1935, and lasted 11 days. The courthouse was packed every single day, with crowds spilling out onto the lawn. Reporters came from Lexington and Louisville, sensing a sensational story. The prosecution built a methodical case, painting Eliza as a woman consumed by greed, who'd carefully planned multiple murders to consolidate her inheritance. The defense fought hard, arguing that the prosecution's case was speculative, that Mary's testimony was unreliable, that the evidence could be interpreted in multiple ways. They portrayed Eliza as a grieving widow who'd lost her husband to tragedy and was now being scapegoated for a series of unfortunate events. The testimony that ultimately sealed Eliza's fate came from her own daughter Caroline. On day 9 of the trial, under intense pressure and facing potential charges herself as an accessory, Caroline broke down on the witness stand and admitted that her mother had confessed to killing Vernon. Eliza had planned the sabotage meticulously, had executed it perfectly, and had told Caroline that it was necessary to preserve the family's legacy. Caroline also testified that she believed her mother had orchestrated Thomas's death, making it look like a drunken accident, and had either directly killed or hired someone to kill Samuel. She couldn't prove the latter claims, but her testimony about Vernon was devastating. The jury deliberated for 13 hours before returning a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Vernon Blackburn. The judge sentenced Eliza to death by hanging, though the sentence was later commuted to life in prison. The governor intervened after a petition campaign arguing that executing a woman, even a convicted murderess, was barbaric. Eliza served 19 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary before dying of cancer in 1954. She never admitted to the murders and never showed remorse. But Eliza's arrest and conviction didn't end the death curse hanging over the Mortimer family. With Eliza in prison, the inheritance redistribution continued according to Silas's Byzantine rules. James Mortimer, Samuel's widow Anne, and several grandchildren now controlled substantial portions of the estate, and the pattern of deaths resumed. In June of 1935, one of Thomas's sons, Joseph Mortimer, 28 years old, was found dead in a barn fire. The fire was ruled accidental, caused by a lantern knocked over, but the timing was suspicious. In September, Margaret's eldest son Franklin died from what appeared to be a hunting accident, shot through the chest by an unknown shooter while tracking deer. No one was ever charged. By December of 1935, 7 heirs were dead, 7 deaths in less than 2 years. Sheriff Hargrove was exhausted and haunted. He'd arrested 1 killer, had secured a conviction, but the deaths continued. It was becoming clear that either Eliza had accomplices who were continuing her work, or, more terrifyingly, multiple family members had independently decided that murder was an acceptable path. Wealth, the breakthrough in understanding, came not from investigation, but from tragedy. In February of 1936, Ann Mortimer, Samuel's widow, one of the kindest women anyone had ever known, took her own life. She left a note, barely legible through tear-stained ink, explaining that she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Ann confessed to being part of a conspiracy with Eliza. They'd planned together to eliminate certain heirs, agreeing to split the benefits. Ann had provided the moonshine to Thomas, knowing it would make him reckless, and had arranged for him to be on that particular trail at that particular time. She'd suggested that Eliza hire someone to kill Samuel, her own husband, because Samuel had discovered their plan and threatened to expose them. Ann claimed she'd been coerced, that Eliza had threatened her children if she didn't cooperate, but the confession made clear that she'd been complicit in at least 2 murders. The note devastated the community. Ann had been seen as a victim, a tragic widow. The revelation that she'd been instrumental in her own husband's murder was almost incomprehensible. Sheriff Hargrove reopened the investigations with Ann's confession as a roadmap. He arrested 3 more people: Caroline Blackburn as an accessory to her father's murder, a cousin named Daniel Mortimer who'd been hired by Eliza to stage Franklin's hunting accident, and James Mortimer, who Ann's note implicated in Joseph's barn fire. James was the most shocking arrest. He'd been a primary suspect for months, but had never been charged due to lack of evidence. Ann's note provided that evidence, explaining that James had promised to eliminate Thomas's remaining sons if Ann and Eliza would support his claim to the homestead after Silas's death. The subsequent trials consumed most of 1936 and early 37. Caroline was sentenced to 15 years as an accessory. Daniel received 25 years for Franklin's murder. James was sentenced to death for Joseph's murder, though like Eliza before him, his sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment. By the time the legal proceedings ended, 9 members of the Mortimer family were dead: Thomas, Ephraim, Samuel, Vernon, Joseph, Franklin, Ann by suicide, and 2 others who died in the chaos and subsequent investigations, one from a stroke brought on by stress, another from an overdose of laudanum that may have been accidental or may have been self-administered. 9 people, 13 original heirs. The family had been decimated. Silas Mortimer witnessed all of this from his homestead on the mountain. He'd turned 75 in 1935, 76 in 36. Each death, each arrest, each revelation aged him beyond his years. The man who tried to preserve his family's legacy through careful planning had instead created a mechanism for its destruction. In March of 1937, Silas called a lawyer from Lexington, a different lawyer, one with no previous connection to the family, and dictated a new will. This one was simple to the point of brutality. All remaining property would be sold at auction after his death, with proceeds divided equally among surviving blood descendants. No provisions, no special considerations, no complicated mechanisms. Just money divided equally, end of story. He also added a codicil that stunned the lawyer. Any heir convicted of murdering another family member would be entirely disinherited, with their portion donated to the county for establishment of school. Silas died in his sleep on June 3, 1937. He was 76 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, and this time there was no suspicion of foul play. The old man's heart had simply given out, worn down by grief and guilt. The estate auction took place in October of 1937. The 3,000 acres of Mortimer land, the mineral rights, the homestead, the outbuildings, everything was sold piecemeal to the highest bidders. Mining companies bought most of the mineral rights. Timber companies purchased the forested land. Local farmers acquired the cultivable acres. The homestead itself was purchased by a family from Virginia who'd heard about the property and wanted a mountain retreat, blissfully unaware of the blood that had been spilled over it. The total proceeds came to $46,000 more than anyone had expected, despite the Depression, because the coal seam beneath the property proved even richer than anticipated. After legal fees, after the portions donated to establish a school as per Silas's codicil, after everything was settled, each of the 4 surviving blood heirs received approximately $8,000. $8,000. In 1937, this was a substantial sum, enough to buy a house in town, start a business, or live modestly for years. But for 9 people to die for it, for a family to be torn apart, for multiple people to spend their lives in prison, for children to be orphaned and communities to be traumatized. The arithmetic of blood money never quite adds up. The surviving Mortimer family members scattered after the auction. Some left Kentucky entirely, carrying their shame and their money to other states where the name Mortimer didn't carry such dark associations. A few stayed but changed their names, trying to build new lives without the weight of their family history. None of them, as far as records show, ever spoke publicly about what happened. Sheriff Hargrove retired in 1939, his health broken by the years of investigation. He moved to Lexington, where he lived quietly until his death in 1952. In his personal papers, discovered after his death, he'd written extensively about the Mortimer case, trying to make sense of how a simple inheritance could corrupt so completely. One passage stands out. "I've spent 25 years as a lawman in these mountains. I've seen feuds that lasted generations, violence that seemed senseless, cruelty born of desperation and ignorance, but the Mortimer case taught me something darker. It wasn't ignorance that killed those people. It was intelligence applied to evil purpose. It wasn't passion that destroyed that family. It was calculation. Give people something to fight over, tell them the rules are complicated, make them suspicious of each other, and then stand back. You don't need to pull the trigger. You've already loaded the gun." The school that was established with the disinherited portions of the estate, named Cumberland Mountain School, operated for 43 years before consolidating with the county school system in 1980. During its operation, it educated hundreds of children from the hollows and mountains of Harlan County, giving them opportunities their parents never had. It was a small redemption in a story largely devoid of them. The land itself, broken up and sold, continued to be productive. The coal seam was mined extensively from the 1940s through the 1970s, generating millions of dollars for the companies that owned the rights, dollars that never reached the Mortimer family, who'd sold everything for immediate cash in 1937. The homestead stood until 1968, when it was demolished to make way for a strip mining operation. Nothing physical remains of the Mortimer compound today, except stone foundations slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But the story persists. In Harlan County, among those who know the history, the name Mortimer still carries a warning. Don't be like the Mortimers. Parents tell children who squabble over toys or privileges, "Don't let money make you forget blood." It's become a local cautionary tale, simplified and mythologized over generations, but retaining its essential truth. Greed destroys more surely than any external threat. There are lingering mysteries even now, nearly 90 years later. Who actually killed Thomas? Eliza claimed innocence to her death, and Anne's confession didn't specifically address Thomas's death. Was it murder or truly an accident? If murder, who planned it, and did they escape justice? What happened to Colton Reese, the drifter who disappeared after Samuel's death? Did he kill Samuel on Eliza's orders, or was the $50 payment truly innocent? Was he killed himself to eliminate a witness, or did he simply move on, unaware that he'd ever been a suspect? Did other heirs die from natural causes, or were there more murders that were never detected? The barn fire that killed Joseph was ruled accidental, but was it? The hunting accident that claimed Franklin was never solved, but was Daniel Mortimer really the shooter, or was his confession coerced? And perhaps most hauntingly, what was Silas thinking when he drafted that original will? Was he truly trying to be fair, to balance the competing needs of his descendants? Or did some darker impulse drive him, a desire to see who among his family was worthy, to test them through adversity? Did he realize that he was creating the conditions for disaster, or was he blind to the human capacity for evil when confronted with opportunity? We'll never know for certain. Silas took his thoughts to the grave, and everyone who might have understood his motivations died decades ago. What remains is the record court documents, newspaper accounts, personal letters, testimony, and the inescapable pattern of cause and effect. A will was written, 9 people died, a family was destroyed. Wealth that might have sustained generations for a century was squandered in a few years of legal fees and property sales. The story of the Mortimer inheritance resonates because it's fundamentally a story about human nature, at its most naked and vulnerable. Strip away the historical setting, the mountain location, the specific details, and you're left with a universal truth. We are capable of terrible things when we believe our survival or prosperity is at stake. The Depression context is crucial but not determinative. Yes, these events unfolded during America's worst economic crisis, when desperation was a daily reality for millions. But plenty of families navigated the Depression without resorting to murder. The Mortimers weren't driven to violence by hunger or immediate threat. They were driven by the promise of wealth, by the gap between what they had and what they might have, by comparison and envy and the gnawing sense that they deserved more. This is, in many ways, more disturbing than if they'd killed for bread. A person who steals to feed their children can be understood, even forgiven. But to kill family members, people you've known your entire life, who share your blood and your history, for money you don't immediately need, for property that might someday be valuable, that requires a calculus of evil that transcends circumstantial desperation. The case also illuminates the danger of complexity in systems that govern human behavior. Silas's will wasn't a simple document. It was a labyrinth of provisions and clauses, designed to balance competing interests and prevent outside exploitation. But that very complexity created opacity, and in that opacity, evil found room to operate. If the will had been simple, if Silas had just divided the property equally and been done with it, would the murders still have occurred? Perhaps. But the complicated inheritance structure created confusion, which created suspicion, which created the conditions where family members could convince themselves that murder was justified, or at least that it might go undetected. There's a lesson here about governance and rules more broadly. The more complicated a system becomes, the more room it creates for manipulation and exploitation. Simplicity is its own form of justice, not because its more equitable simple systems can be deeply unfair, but because its clarity prevents the kind of interpretive games that allow people to rationalize terrible actions. The Mortimer case also reminds us that evil rarely looks like evil from the inside. Eliza Mortimer wasn't a monster. She was a church-going woman who organized community events and raised her daughters with etiquette and education. She believed, right up until her death in prison, that she'd done what was necessary to protect her family's interests. That's the seduction of rationalization, the ability to frame selfishness as duty, greed as stewardship, murder as unfortunate necessity. Anne Mortimer's suicide note is particularly devastating because it reveals a conscience that couldn't sustain the weight of its own actions. She wasn't a sociopath. She knew what she'd done was wrong, understood the magnitude of her betrayal, and ultimately couldn't live with that knowledge. But her conscience awakened too late. Samuel was already dead. Other people had already died. Her own death, tragic as it was, couldn't resurrect anyone or restore what had been destroyed. This pattern of people realizing too late what they've become is perhaps the most universal element of the story. How many times in human history have people looked back at choices made in moments of weakness or desperation and realized they've crossed lines they never imagined crossing? The Mortimers aren't unique in this. They're just unusually well documented. For the descendants who survived, who took their $8,000 and scattered across America, the inheritance must have felt like a curse more than a blessing. How do you enjoy wealth purchased with your relatives' lives? How do you sleep knowing that your prosperity came from multiple murders, even if you weren't directly responsible? Some of them surely spent that money quickly, trying to distance themselves from its source. Others might have lived frugally, treating the money as tainted, something to be minimized rather than enjoyed. We don't know their individual stories, but we can imagine their burden. And what of the community that witnessed all of this? Harlan County in the 1930s was already a place marked by violence. The coal mine wars had made sure of that. But the Mortimer killings were different. These weren't labor disputes or political struggles. This was a family consuming itself. The effect on community trust, on how neighbors viewed each other, must have been profound. If the Mortimers, a family with 7 generations of history, with deep roots and respected members, could turn on each other so viciously, what did that say about the bonds that supposedly held communities together? The establishment of Cumberland Mountain School with the disinherited funds is one of the few redemptive elements in this entire saga. Education, ironically, might have prevented some of these deaths. If the Mortimers had been more educated, more exposed to the world beyond their hollow, more economically secure through legitimate opportunities, would the inheritance have held such magnetic power? Education breaks the cycle of isolation and desperation that makes extreme violence seem like a reasonable option. That school, operating for 4 decades, may have saved lives indirectly by providing children with alternatives to the kind of life that made the original murders conceivable. To this day, when the wind moves through the forests that now cover the former Mortimer homestead, when rain falls on the strip, mined landscapes that replace the mountains Silas once owned, there's a palpable sense of loss. Not the romantic loss of a way of life or a pastoral past, but the loss of human potential. 9 people who might have lived full lives, children who might have been born, contributions to the world that were never made because greed shortened everything. People sometimes visit the former Mortimer property, though there's nothing to see except forest and reclamation. The family cemetery still exists on its hilltop, though many of the stones have fallen and the inscriptions have weathered into illegibility. Tourists occasionally find it, drawn by the sensational story, looking for some physical evidence of the darkness that consumed this family. They find only peace, trees, birdsong, the gentle decay of stone and wood. The violence is gone, only the lesson remains. The story of the Mortimer family remains a disturbing reminder that the most dangerous threats often come from within families, within communities, within ourselves. The inheritance didn't create evil where none existed. It revealed evil that was always possible, waiting for the right circumstances to manifest. Silas Mortimer thought he was building a legacy. Instead, he built a trap, and 9 people died before the trap finally closed. But questions remain, echoing through the decades. How many other families have similar stories buried in their histories, never exposed because the murders went undetected, or because everyone involved took their secrets to the grave? How much of what we call inheritance, not just monetary, but cultural, social, psychological, is actually a burden that destroys as much as it sustains? And when we gather for family events, when we discuss wills and estates and who will get what, are we really just negotiating the distribution of property, or are we testing bonds that might not hold under pressure? To this day, on certain autumn evenings when the mist rises from the hollows and the mountains seem to close in like the walls of a cell, locals report hearing sounds from the former Mortimer property. Nothing supernatural, no ghostly moans or spectral apparitions. Just the ordinary sounds of wind through trees, water over stones, the settling of earth. But to those who know the history, these sounds carry weight. They're reminders that the past isn't really past, that the consequences of our choices ripple forward through time, that blood money, once accepted, stains everything it touches. The Mortimer inheritance ultimately killed more than 9 people. It killed trust. It killed community. It killed the possibility of a family legacy extending forward through generations. And in its place, it left only a cautionary tale, a story told in hushed voices to remind us that some costs are too high, that some wealth isn't worth the price of obtaining it, and that the bonds of family, once broken by greed, can never truly be repaired. If this journey through one of Appalachia's darkest family sagas has resonated with you, if you find yourself contemplating the thin line between ordinary life and tragedy, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with honesty and respect. Leave a like if this account has moved you beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your thoughts on how desperation can corrupt even the strongest familial bonds. What would you do to protect your family's legacy? And at what point does protection become destruction? Until next time, remember that the greatest inheritances can't be measured in acres or dollars. They're measured in integrity preserved, in bonds honored, in the choice to remain human even when circumstances tempt us toward monstrosity. Welcome to the Untold Hour. There are always more stories waiting in the shadows.